All right, guys, welcome back to the Pocket Mads channel. It's Maddie here, and today we're going to highlight some really cool decks that did well recently at online tournaments that, we don't necessarily consider to be at the top of the meta game ladder, the tier list traditionally, you know what I'm saying? This is a really fun video every week because sometimes the metagame surprises you. At this point, we are, again, into our third week of the Pulsing Aura season, which is kind of crazy because I think either tomorrow or Friday, we should be getting the next set announcement trailer, which is crazy how quickly it went by. There's some speculation that that new trailer for the next mini set's coming out tomorrow. I suspect it's going to come out Friday, but either way, as soon as we get the trailer and we get some new cards revealed, I'm going to dive right in and you guys can hear my opinions about it. That being said, we are in the third week, like I said, so things are a bit more streamlined in terms of like the metagame, right? Ranked releases, there are some less tournaments going on, and the results of the tournaments and everything going on in the first couple of weeks really defines the metagame. So things are a bit more concrete. It's really in that like last week before the new set comes out that people start to play some kind of crazy decks. So think about that. Understand that that's kind of what's going on in the metagame. Lots of Sleep Scam, lots of Lucario, lots of Sceptile, lots of Altaria, the traditional stuff. But we kind of covered it a lot on Monday when we kind of did our meta report. But let's dive right into this. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Also, don't forget to register for PMPT number 32, Astounding Aura $100 prize pool. It is this Saturday, May 23rd. This should be the last tournament of this season. I think by the time the next tournament rolls around, it'll be the next season and the new set will come out, which is exciting. But, stay tuned for that, all of that information. The first deck list we're going to take a look at is going to be Jay Khaled 123 from the Pocket Cup. This is going to be Gourgiest and Houndstone. Now, this is definitely an archetype that I have forgot about pretty, severely. I think a lot of people just don't necessarily play this as much as they used to for whatever the reason. I mean, there's obviously several reasons for that. But I think a lot of people do like Houndstone. Gourgeist sees it a lot of play with Altaria. Of course, Meloetta is a very, very good card. The Psychic type deck lists are interesting because, the Psychic archetype is pretty well defined by a lot of different support cards. It really feels to me that the Psychic typing in Pokemon Pocket is defined by like all of the different supportive Pokemon that you can play and the flexibility. And then I think that the Stadium that is specific to Psychic cards being Peculiar Plaza, which gives them all free retreat, kind of allows you to play multiple different Psychic type Pokemon in your deck list and kind of swap them in and out with a little bit more ease. So I think that's the general concept. What's cool though is that, as a Psychic archetype, it does have a pretty solid single prize archetype built into it. I would really like it if more types had things like this. Like the Houndstone, Gourgeist stuff was, to be honest, one of the best single prize archetypes like of all time in the metagame, at least over the last couple of seasons. But I think recently it hasn't seen a ton of play. Houndstone can deal a ton of damage. I still don't think this thing is as strong as like say Hydreigon or even something like Oricorio and Magnezone, some of those other single prize archetype Pokemon in the lightning type archetypes. Yeah, it's definitely still a pretty strong deck list. I don't know how its matchup spreads, kind of work this season just because the data is probably pretty limited and we haven't seen it a whole lot. This player here lost to Sceptile in top 16, lost to a Lucario deck as well as a Sleep Altaria deck, but did beat Sleep Altaria, Hydreigon, Lucario, Charizard, Manectric, and Meowscarada. So these are all like pretty top tier meta decks in the current metagame. Also Gourgiest, or Gourgiest, I don't know how people pronounce that Pokemon, Gen 5 Goat, and Chandelure, so that's a cool deck that he faced. But anyway, a really fun deck. I don't think that there's too much surprise here. Again, the whole concept of Last Respects is that this attack does 20 more damage for each Psychic Pokemon in your discard pile. And what's really cool about this deck list here, of course, is that you can play things like Klefki, which have the tool removal effect, and then it gets put in your discard pile. So it's basically a free, usable, discardable Psychic Pokemon. But then you have Gourgeist, which discards cards from your hand, right? So theoretically speaking, you really only need, sorry, I moved ahead there. Really all you need is like maybe a couple of Houndstones, or maybe even one at the end of the game to kind of one-hit KO a big Pokemon. And, Gourgeist can deal some really solid chip damage. It can deal, this whole deck deals with Oricorio nicely. I just really like this archetype because it all fits together and it makes sense. And of course, Meloetta helps you draw Psychic type Pokemon. So even if you go Meloetta into a Gourgeist into a Houndstone, theoretically you should be dealing a decent amount of damage. One thing we are missing that could really turn this archetype upside down, and maybe we get it in the next mini set, is a supporter card that discards cards from your hand, right? This is a popular thing in Pokemon TCG. This is a tangent, but in the official TCG, like oftentimes draw supporters, whether it's an actual supporter card or an item or a Pokemon, they oftentimes discard cards from your hand to do it. Pocket has some of those types of stuff, but like Professor's Research and Copycat, you know, they don't discard anything, right? So theoretically speaking, if we were to get a card like that draws cards and then you discard cards, you know, would be extremely good for an archetype like this. I don't know if we're ever going to get something like that in Pocket because it's only 20 card deck lists. And of course, the official TCG has, you know, 60 card decks and you can fly through them. So it's a little bit different. But yeah, anyway, a unique archetype. So shout out to Jay Khaled. Really, really fun deck list. And I'm happy to see Houndstone and Gourgiest doing well, at least at a tournament this week. Next up is going to be Gabby Kem from Argentina, 9-1 at the Highlights Blazing Inferno number 19. And this is going to be that Evolution Bounded Field deck that we saw, I think, in the first weekend of PMPT this season. And it kind of went away a little bit, especially since like dark type decks became a little bit less relevant. But this is still one of my favorite decks so far this entire season. And it's basically a dual evolution deck between grass and psychic type, being Leafeon and Espeon, and then Bounded Field, which allows these Pokemon to hit for double damage when you hit for weakness on those relevant Pokemon that are either weak to grass or weak to psychic. You know, fighting decks are pretty popular. So Espeon, of course, you know, can deal a lot of damage. It actually does stack with red, so like the multiplier happens after the damage increase with red. So that's why you see red in these decks, is because like Espeon hits for 180, but like when you play red, that's 100, and then it multiplies that by 2 after the 100, so then that's 200 damage on like a Mega Lucario. It's really fun. Indeedee as well, so like Bounded Field will work for Indeedee and Ogerpon, which fits seamlessly into this deck. This is one of the big reasons why I love this deck, is because, you know, Ogerpon and Indeedee are incredibly useful bench-sitting Pokemon, like ancillary Pokemon that you play in respective grass decks or psychic type decks. And as you see here, this is a deck that plays both grass and psychic Pokemon, being Leafeon and Espeon, which is pretty cool. Leafeon here is the single prize attacker of choice, double boosted evolution, EV1, EVEX. It's a really, really fun deck. Like one of the most fun decks that I had this entire season, especially early on when there was still a lot of Hydreigon, or early in the season when it was like mostly Lucario, and then you would see like a lot of Zoroark or things like that. This was an incredibly fun deck. I mean, dark decks do see a little bit of play still. If we take a look at this player's matchup spreads, I am curious. They went 9-1, which is crazy. Ended up losing to Meowscarada, unfortunately, but went on an absolute tear, beating Lucario, Hydreigon, beating a Blaziken, which is crazy, beating Alteri, Greninja, Lucario again, Manectric, Lucario, right? So you can kind of see how Bounded Field plus the Psychic, attacking Pokemon, Indeedee can deal a lot of damage. Bounded Field and Indeedee will 1-hit KO Lucario as well. So beating a lot of fighting type decks, which is cool. Beating one dark type deck, but unfortunately losing to Meowscarada, which, you know, is also a 2-prize archetype that can sustain a little bit better probably than Leafeon. So that's probably not a great matchup. Shout out to Imp LBN, but this is just such a fun deck list. I do think that Leafeon is like the core, right? So if you're going to be doing a dual type evolution deck, you kind of have to play Leafeon because it's the only evolution that can generate its own energies. But you could technically pair Leafeon with anything. As we saw in previous seasons, we paired it with Flareon, which might be an interesting choice. In fact, Leafeon Flareon with a Bounded Field, you know, theoretically would be pretty decent, because then you could hit some of those grass type decks for weakness, like Meowscarada, like Sceptile, and 1-hit KO them, which would be pretty cool. I wonder actually if, well, I guess Flareon could KO Meowscarada EX like with weakness anyway, because it does a lot of damage. As like one, you can extend a lot with Flareon, but for Sceptile, you would just sort of need the Bounded Field to 1-hit KO. So that's something to keep your eye on. Grass and Fire could be definitely pretty interesting. We've seen Grass and Lightning before. Lightning is less of a good offensive typing these days. Anyway, super cool deck list. Shout out to Gabby Kem. Love it. Next up is going to be Brendan from PMPT 31 this past weekend. So Brendan was playing Flygon, and they made it all the way to day 2, had a great 7-2 record. And I think we meant to highlight a Flygon deck in last week's video, but I guess somehow we just forgot to. But a really cool run. Ended up losing in top 64 to Lucario, but, you know, beat a variety of different decks here in day 1. This is a really fun deck list. I think that Flygon is probably one of the better Dragon-type Pokemon that we've seen for quite some time. More recently, people have been playing it with Sylveon for the extra draw support, which is another really cool aspect of this deck, because, I think a lot of people might not necessarily remember Sylveon. Maybe everybody remembers Sylveon, but it was just everywhere for a brief moment before we had Suicune and the other legendary beasts that were somewhat of a better draw effect. Sylveon was incredible, and it still is really good. Like, I think it's one of those underrated Pokemon in the game that people just don't play anymore. Probably since now that we have Copycat, you don't necessarily need to be playing these Pokemon to draw cards, but Sylveon, really effective to move through your deck really quickly. And then, yeah, that's really just the core of the deck. And then you're playing Flygon with Rocky Helmet and Lily. And that's it, right? So the whole concept is to get into Flygon as early as possible, draw through your deck with Sylveons, keep Flygon alive somewhat well with like one copy of Lily, but at the end of the day, it's just more so about the damage. And to be honest, like if you can get the second Flygon set up, you could actually start committing your energies to that second Flygon preemptively, because, you know, most of the time just having the Flygon in the active with Rocky Helmet is going to be enough to deal enough damage across the board to where maybe the next Flygon, when it comes in, is going to be able to KO with that 140 damage attack. It's not a bad deck list whatsoever. I do wish that Flygon was just like a little bit better, and I understand Dragon Pokemon always suffer from the dual energy type attacks, and that's certainly a massive downside to really any dragon type Pokemon. Whenever you have to play multi-energy in your deck and you're not really playing a Pokemon that can generate its own energies, it's going to be a pretty inherent big downside from a consistency standpoint. But that aside, I do think Flygon EX is probably one of the better dragon Pokemon we've ever had. I feel strongly that a deck like this could see a bit more play or could have a bit more potential. I think that the downside primarily to Flygon is that it just feels like it's missing like one other thing. And you can kind of see that in the sense that like we're just playing Sylveon to move through the deck list, right? But the strategy is very linear. It's very one-dimensional. You know, you're trying to do the same thing every game. It doesn't really matter what, you know, your opponent is playing or what's going on in the game. Imagine if we were to get like a bench sitting Pokemon that, you know, while on the bench, you know, maybe did like bench damage spread, like just as an effect or something. I don't know. Just something that you could maybe add an additional layer to Flygon to have it be a little bit better. I don't know what else I'm trying to say. I'm also like sweating right now. It's so hot right now in my office, by the way. So if I look like I'm really hot, I am. It's very hot right now. Anyway, shout out to Flygon. Really cool deck. Flygon's been seeing some play. Like I wonder just how much of the metagame has been people playing Flygon. Definitely kind of one of those like niche off meta decks that came out in Pulsing Aura, but it's a little bit better than I initially kind of give it credit for, which is kind of cool. So you know what? Shout out to Flygon. It's really cool. At the end of the day, it's just a really cool deck list. So I'm glad some people are playing it. And next up is going to be Fall 88 from Taiwan. This is going to be 18 Trainer Oricorio. Now, this is not the only player that's played 18 Trainer Oricorio. I believe there were some tournaments prior to this this past weekend where 18 Trainer Oricorio went very far, and there's actually been some instances of it doing well in tournaments so far this week as well. But I just want to at least highlight it once on the channel because this is something that's seeing a little bit of play in tournaments. It's kind of a meme, but keep in mind, like, Oricorio theoretically is enough to sometimes win games, right? Like, whenever you play an Oricorio deck, Oricorio oftentimes is that Pokemon that allows you to win games. The only downside to just playing Oricorio with nothing else is that you're never really able to deal a ton of damage. So against like sustain decks or decks that just play a bunch of healing or damage reduction, you're never really able to achieve a board state to where you win. But into certain archetypes, like being able to play Oricorio, when you combine it with Giant Cape and Starting Plains, this Pokemon gets 110 HP, right? So like oftentimes, you know, you're able to live attacks from non-EX Pokemon, quite frankly. So Oricorio becomes kind of tanky, and then you have double Lucky Ice Pop, double Potion, even a Leftovers and a PCL thrown in, and that's the whole concept of the deck list, is to hope that your opponent's Pokemon, if they are playing any that, you know, are non-EX Pokemon that can attack Oricorio, you're hoping that they just don't deal enough damage and that Oricorio will be able to deal with them in the head-to-head, and then, you know, you can win the game just by doing that. And it's kind of a funny strategy, definitely a bit of a meme. But again, we've seen some of these Oricorio decks actually been very successful so far this season in certain tournaments. It's definitely one of those weird decks where sometimes you just can't lose and sometimes you just can't win, you know? We've had some, you know, situations at PMPT tournaments where certain, you know, end game board states just can't be achieved by certain Oricorio matchups. Which is why, again, we did put in that coin flip rule for like Swiss rounds. But like, you know, if this deck list were to like kind of walk into like a top cut, you know, on stream and face, you know, I don't know, Mega Steelix or an Indeedee deck or something, and then the game just can never end, it's kind of one of those difficult things on the ranked ladder. Like maybe it's something that could work out for you. I don't know. It's not something I've tested myself on the ranked ladder, but I did want to highlight it. Because again, this player did make day 2 at the PMPT tournament. Did lose to Suicune Baxcalibur. I would say that Baxcalibur is probably a pretty decent enough counter to it. And here, as we see Greninja, Blaziken, and then Hydreigon, of course. You know, you're not going to beat Hydreigon, so that's the other thing. But look, I mean, beat Crobat, beat Altaria with Gourgeist. Like, it beat Altaria Gourgeist, which is nuts. Beat Manectric with Zeraora, and even beat Lucario with Hitmontop. So even with weakness, like, it was able to just kind of get around the Hitmontops, and then the game's over. Kind of crazy. Zoroark, another example of a deck that doesn't really have a great option to get around Oricorio with the extra HP. HP and the healing. So it's a funny deck list. It's funny. You know, I don't want to encourage people to play this per se, but it is sort of interesting, and it's something that some people have played this week. So I'm going to highlight at least one person. So shout out to Fall88. Next up, at the Dark League leaderboard, I wanted to highlight Super Piece's Charizard deck because I just feel like we have not been talking about Charizard at all this season for whatever the reason is. I do think that Lucario coming in and kind of filling a similar niche, being able to 1-hit KO Pokemon while being a little bit less of a late game focus deck list. Lucario is definitely a little bit better into most matchups. Like as long as Lucario can take that 1-hit KO, then it just sort of is better than Charizard. But you know, Charizard is definitely not a bad Pokemon to any degree. This deck list here, Super Piece went 6-1-1. Lost this week in Excalibur, which is going to happen, unfortunately. Beat double Oricorios, though, so you love to see that. Probably because he's playing a non-EX Charizard. Yeah, he's playing the Inferno Onrush Charizard, which is cool. So you beat the Oricorio decks. I just kind of wanted to talk about Charizard inherently because I think it's something that's sort of forgotten about. It is strange, when I talk about how certain types in Pokemon Pocket are defined, like their identity, Fire type has access to Pokemon that deal a lot of damage traditionally, but discard energies after they attack or have like significant drawbacks. So one of the things that, the Fire type decks have gotten in recent times is Flame Patch, right? And that's, I guess, kind of like part of the identity of Fire type decks is like, hey, we deal like a lot of damage. Blaziken is kind of a Pokemon that doesn't deal that much damage, but like, I don't know. I guess there are fire type Pokemon that do a variety of different things, but traditionally discarding energies or having drawbacks to your attack effects is somewhat common. Like Blaziken discards an energy and whatnot. So even if they don't deal a ton of damage, there's like the energy drawback for fire type decks, and then we have Flame Patch. Charizard's weird because it just does a bunch of damage. You know what I mean? I said specifically that Charizard would get better as time went on if more and more decks were kind of based around other mega Pokemon. And I do think that that was a correct statement because Charizard was actually somewhat relevant for quite some time. But then again, Lucario came out and it really sort of just filled the same niche as Charizard, but did a little bit more better in certain matchups. So it's weird. It's a weird thing, but Charizard did well this week, and I feel like we haven't talked about Charizard at all this season, so I wanted to just kind of give you an example of someone playing Charizard, even though this is probably a deck that most people understand. It's weird because we also have Charizard X, and I think that Charizard X is a very good Pokemon. It's just awkward in the sense that there's sometimes it's just not, it's not relevant, right? Like the math just maybe doesn't line up. Mega Charizard X is specifically incredibly good into like 2-prize EX Pokemon that you can 1-hit KO after you tank a hit because you have a lot of HP. But in a Mega Pokemon, Charizard X just really isn't that good, and Mega Charizard Y is good. But then again, why not just play Lucario and 1-hit KO Pokemon anyway? You know what I mean? It's a weird thing. So Blaziken's seen a little bit of play this season, but as we've talked about, it's been a bit fraudulent. You know, where are we at for the Fire archetype? I honestly expect maybe a new Fire type Pokemon to come in and be somewhat relevant. I do think we're kind of missing like a really solid, like an actually good Fire type deck. I'm not saying Charizard's not good and Blaziken, but like they're not, I don't know, they're not like top tier meta contending. I don't think any Fire type decks are necessarily this season. So yeah. Maybe I think Flareon also, by the way, discards fire energies. So anyway, yeah, there's Charizard. Next up, oh, by the way, shout out to Super Piece. Shout out to him. Next up at the Evade Exos Community Pog Tourney #1 is going to be, excuse me, Pigeon Pagan. I don't know. From Australia, Mega Venusaur, another deck that we just have not talked about at all. Mega Venusaur is a strong Pokemon. It's weird because I do think that a lot of the, or the recent buffs to the grass type archetypes being Fragrant Forest is just not something that benefited Venusaur really at all. I think most people pretty early on figured that Venusaur was better just by itself, just as, you know, a strategy that was all about getting Venusaur set up as consistently as possible and then hoping that it was enough to win games. Fragrant Forest is really great in terms of those grass type decks to populate your board with different Pokemon that have different effects, like Ogerpon, like Celebi, things like that. Venusaur just does not do any of that, which is kind of a weird thing. Also, Sceptile came out this season, and I think in general is a much more, what's the term? I guess it's a much more like traditional good, Pokemon Pocket Pokemon deck, like it just does like a decent amount of damage, has decent HP, low energy cost. It's easy to get going. Like Sceptile just sort of replaced really any and all grass type decks. And it's funny because Meowscarada this season popped up as sort of like the secondary option. But again, those are decks that benefit a lot from Fragrant Forest. Venusaur just doesn't really have that going for it. But, we know Venusaur is really strong. Another Pokemon that, again, with double Lily and double Erica, into like that Oricorio 18 trainer deck, like the game will not end. You'll just won't lose to the Oricorio, and you probably won't be able to beat it either. And it's just another kind of weird aspect of Venusaur is that this traditionally was a deck that, you know, never really lost to Oricorio, but was never really able to beat it either because we don't have any other attacking options. So things like Meowscarada, like Sceptile, sort of have a bit more leniency when it comes to that matchup specifically, which I think is also a pretty big upside. But here's Venusaur. Somebody played it. That somebody was Pigeon Pagan. This tournament went 7-3. Ended up losing to Kev11 playing Mega Charizard Y. But yeah, had a pretty decent run throughout the tournament. So you know what? Shout out to him. Love to see it. Next up and lastly is going to be my favorite result of this entire week, and it is a Mega Swampert. You guys remember Mega Swampert, dude? One of my favorite Pokemon of all time. I really thought this Pokemon had a lot of potential when I was playing it. It's got such a funny attack. It does 150 for 3 water energies, which isn't even that hard of a condition to satisfy. To get water energies on a Pokemon is pretty easy. And you discard 2 random energies among all of the Pokemon on the board. Now, the funny thing about Swampert is that sometimes that's your Pokemon, which is kind of a meme, quite frankly. This deck does play double Mantike, Manaphy, and Misty, so we're satisfying that additional energy cost to try to ramp up a little bit. But Swampert was always a very impressive Pokemon. 230 HP, 150 damage. Stage 2, you get access to Lily. Honestly, I kind of feel like if the effect of this attack wasn't so like RNG focused, it would be significantly better. You know what I mean? I think people shied away from it because it was a bit of an RNG deck, but coincidentally, one of my favorite Mega Pokemon of all time, and I think it's something that most people have forgotten about. But somebody played it again. You know, shout out to NY or N8Y at the Breakfast Club late night, who went 5-2-1, ended up losing to Altaria Sleep, which is unfortunate. But yeah, really cool deck, and I love Swampert. So I saw it and I was like, we got to put it in the video. Shout out to Swampert. But anyway, that's all of the fun results and interesting decks that did well in online tournaments this week. Shout out to all these players. Shout out to all of these tournaments. And shout out to you guys for sticking around here towards the end of the season. Again, we should be getting news of the next set release. The trailer should be coming out in a couple of days, so don't forget to stay tuned for all of that information and all of my opinions that I'm going to give you about the new cards once they release. Hopefully I get some air conditioning in this room that I'm in because I am extremely hot and I'm sweating. So I'm going to wrap up this video. Peace out, guys. Have a good one. Don't forget to register for PMPT number 32 this weekend. And don't forget to stay tuned for the new set release information, which should be coming out soon. All right, guys. Let's get out of here. Peace out. Have a good one. Goodbye. Bye.